Saipan, June 1944. The sun had barely begun to lift above the horizon when the silence was broken by a sharp, clean crack that seemed to come from nowhere. Lieutenant Colonel Haruki Matsuda of the Imperial Japanese Army's 43rd Infantry Division had been speaking to his aides inside a coral dugout overlooking the American beachhead. His words ended in mid-sentence when the officer beside him fell with a perfectly placed hole through his temple. Blood and fragments sprayed across the bunker wall, and for several seconds, no one moved. There had been no flash, no smoke, no sign of movement across the enemy lines nearly a kilometer distant. To Matsuda, it seemed as if death itself had reached out from the empty morning air. The surviving staff officers threw themselves against the walls, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Japanese doctrine taught that a rifle could not deliver accurate fire much beyond 400 meters. They had studied ballistics at Toyama Infantry School, learned the effective ranges of their Type 97 sniper rifles fitted with fragile 2.5 power scopes, and been assured that anything further than 500 meters was fantasy. Yet one of their number had been killed instantly, his skull shattered by a shot so precise it felt supernatural. What Matsuda and his men could not know was that a U.S. Marine scout sniper lay hidden more than 1,100 yards away, his Springfield M19903A1 rifle steady on a sandbag rest, the long tube of an 8-power Unertl scope glinting for only a heartbeat before vanishing into camouflage. Beside him, a spotter whispered confirmation through binoculars, and the sniper logged the distance in a small notebook where wind direction, humidity, and elevation had already been calculated hours earlier. For the Marines, this was not luck, it was science. For the Japanese officers on Saipan, it was something they had no frame of reference to explain. Their soldiers whispered about cursed bullets, invisible weapons, even spirits of the dead aiding the Americans. They searched the horizon for machine gun nests or artillery observers, convinced that no single rifleman could have caused such devastation. Yet, as the days unfolded, more officers collapsed under identical single shots, always sudden, always precise, always without warning. The first part of the Pacific Campaign had shown Japanese infantry that the Marines were brave and relentless. But on Saipan, they discovered something far more terrifying, an unseen enemy who could kill at distances they considered impossible. And in the humid morning air of June 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Matsuda realized his command was no longer safe, not even deep inside a fortified bunker. The Americans had introduced a new kind of warfare, one that struck with mathematical certainty from beyond the edge of vision. On Guadalcanal in 1942, Japanese soldiers first began whispering about the mysterious precision fire that seemed to cut down their officers one by one. A platoon gathered in the jungle clearing to hear instructions from their lieutenant, the men sweating under the oppressive humidity, when without warning, the officer's head snapped back and he collapsed in front of them. The sound of the rifle shot reached the clearing 2 full seconds later. Panic rippled through the ranks. There had been no advancing patrols, no visible enemy, just a sudden surgical death delivered from an unseen source. At first, many soldiers refused to believe it had been the work of a single rifleman. They convinced themselves it must have been artillery fragments, perhaps even a hidden machine gun at close range. The concept that one man with one rifle could strike so far away defied everything they had been taught. Officers who had trained in marksmanship schools in Japan knew their rifles could not deliver such accuracy. To them, the very idea seemed absurd. Yet the bodies continued to fall, and always the fatal wounds were the same. A perfect strike to the head or chest, never wasted, never erratic. Veterans who had fought in China, men hardened by years of combat, found themselves whispering like frightened recruits. How could a single shooter see them through jungle canopy? How could he find them in the half-light of dawn, when even their own eyes struggled to distinguish shapes? The more it happened, the more fear began to corrode discipline. Patrols hesitated to move in daylight. Runners delayed delivering messages. Young soldiers began looking to the sky, wondering if American aircraft were somehow involved, because the alternative explanation, that a lone rifleman was watching them from distances measured in thousands of feet, was too hard to accept. For the Marines, this disbelief worked in their favor. Each time a Japanese officer dismissed the warnings as exaggeration, another fell to a bullet they never saw coming. And among the Japanese infantry, a dreadful realization spread slowly but relentlessly. They were not simply facing another infantryman. They were being hunted by a ghost with a rifle. The difference lay in the glass. For decades, Japanese doctrine had placed faith in the courage of the soldier, in his willingness to fight and die with honor, while treating optics as a luxury of little consequence. Their Type 97 sniper rifles mounted small 2.5 power scopes, fragile instruments that distorted at the edges and lost clarity in the humidity of the tropics. These sights were meant for ranges no greater than a few hundred meters, and even then, required constant readjustment after each shot. The Marines brought something else entirely. Their Springfield M1903A1 rifles had been handpicked for accuracy, fitted with star-gauge barrels and match-grade triggers. Onto these rifles went the Unertl 8-power scope, a tube of steel and precision-ground glass that transformed the weapon into something the Japanese had never conceived. A system capable of consistent, repeatable hits beyond 1,000 yards. Its external adjustment knobs clicked in quarter-minute increments, allowing the sniper to correct for wind, elevation, and even the subtle pull of the earth itself. On the Pacific Front, this was not just technology, but a revolution. With the Unertl scope, the sniper's eye extended far beyond normal vision. What appeared to Japanese troops as a dense wall of jungle became, through eightfold magnification, a clear panorama where officers could be picked out by the swords at their sides or the way soldiers deferred to them. Places thought hidden, a ravine, a supply path, a shaded trail, stood revealed in crystal clarity. Japanese officers found their old rules crumbling. Distance no longer meant safety. A map study on a ridge hundreds of meters behind the lines could end with a single crack in the air, and another leader struck down. Observing the battlefield from what they believed a secure perch became an invitation to death. The Marines had rewritten the boundaries of infantry combat. Where once rifles were seen as weapons of a few hundred yards, now they reached across entire valleys, striking targets that Japanese doctrine considered unreachable. The glass and steel of the Unertl scope had changed not only the mechanics of marksmanship, but the very psychology of battle. To the Japanese soldier, the enemy now possessed eyes that could pierce jungle, stone, and distance itself. And those eyes never missed. It was the distance that shocked them most. At first, Japanese officers tried to dismiss the stories as exaggerations born of panic. Yet the reports became impossible to ignore. Men were dying at ranges far beyond anything their training had prepared them for. On Saipan, a captain collapsed while moving between trench lines nearly a kilometer from the nearest American position. On Peleliu, a staff officer studying his map behind the front was struck clean through the throat, the bullet arriving long before anyone heard the crack of the shot. Veterans who had fought in China and Burma were stunned. They had faced ambushes, artillery barrages, even long-range machine gun fire, but never this. Single bullets fired with such precision that men seemed plucked from life by an invisible hand. The sheer accuracy was demoralizing. A shot to the head, a shot to the chest, never wasted, never random. What made it incomprehensible was not just the lethality, but the calm inevitability. Soldiers wrote in diaries that death came without warning, without sound, without chance to resist. The bullet arrived first, the rifle's report echoing only seconds later, like distant thunder. To Japanese infantry, it felt as if the Americans wielded a new kind of weapon, some form of death ray or hidden artillery piece, because no ordinary rifle could reach that far with such deadly effect. For the Marines behind the scopes, the extraordinary shots were the product of painstaking calculation. They logged the humidity, measured the wind by watching the movement of distant leaves, adjusted their sights by fractions of an inch, and waited for the perfect moment. They had trained for years on competition ranges where a 1,000-yard shot was routine. Now, on the coral ridges of the Pacific, that discipline turned into battlefield dominance. Among Japanese ranks, the realization spread slowly, then with growing dread. The enemy could kill them from distances where they could scarcely even see a human figure. Safe zones no longer existed. Every ridge, every clearing, every rise in the ground might conceal the long barrel of an American sniper rifle. And once that rifle was aimed, there was no escape. To survive against such invisible hunters, the Marines relied on more than their rifles. They had mastered the art of vanishing. A sniper could lie motionless for hours in blistering heat, hidden beneath layers of burlap and foliage. His skin darkened with mud to break the shine of sweat. They built nests of coral rock, hollowed depressions in the jungle floor, even tied themselves into the twisted roots of banyan trees, all to remain unseen while their scopes searched for targets. Japanese patrols often passed within yards of these concealed positions, never realizing they were under the gaze of an 8-power optic. The discipline was absolute. No wasted movement, no careless sound. A mosquito bite went unscratched. A bead of sweat rolled into an eye without reaction. The sniper's body became part of the terrain, his rifle an extension of the landscape. Spotters aided the deception. While the sniper peered through the scope, his partner scanned with binoculars, noting patrol routes, officer movements, and the telltale gestures of command. Together, they formed a team that could watch an enemy for days, waiting for the precise instant when a target exposed himself. Sometimes they never fired at all, returning instead with sketches of enemy defenses more detailed than any aerial reconnaissance. For Japanese soldiers, this invisibility created a suffocating paranoia. They could not see the enemy, could not strike back, could not even be sure where the killing shot had come from. Entire platoons hesitated to move in daylight, convinced the jungle itself held eyes watching them. An officer lifting his head above a trench line did so, with the knowledge that unseen crosshairs might already be waiting. In this way, Marine snipers shaped the battlefield without firing a shot. Their presence, real or imagined, froze movements, delayed attacks, forced commanders underground. To Japanese infantry, it seemed the Americans were not men at all, but shadows merged with the earth. Ghosts who appeared only to kill, and then fade back into silence. And for every officer who fell to a bullet, dozens more lived in constant fear that the next invisible shot was already meant for them. The fear soon took on a life of its own. Among the ranks of Japanese infantry, stories spread like wildfire, of Americans who could see through jungle leaves, of rifles that fired invisible projectiles, of ghostly hunters who struck without ever being seen. Some soldiers whispered that the Marines had trained eagles to guide their shots. Others believed the Americans had discovered a new weapon, some secret device that could pierce armor and bone from beyond the horizon. The myths deepened with every battle. On Tarawa, survivors swore that American snipers could shoot through walls, for men had died while crouching behind thick coral barriers. On Saipan, rumors claimed the enemy could bend bullets around corners, because soldiers hiding behind rocks were still found with neat holes through their skulls. The more inexplicable the deaths, the more supernatural the explanations became. To the Marines, these beliefs were almost an advantage, as real as their rifles. A shot fired at dawn could pin an entire company for hours, the survivors crawling like insects across the dirt, rather than risk standing upright. Even without ammunition spent, the legend of the invisible rifleman grew heavier with every retelling. Japanese commanders found their men reluctant to patrol by day, unwilling to use obvious paths, and increasingly disobedient to orders that placed them in exposed ground. Captured diaries revealed the depth of the terror. One soldier wrote that he felt the cold gaze of death on his neck, as if unseen eyes had marked him. Another described his unit crawling across an airfield, paralyzed not by artillery or machine guns, but by the expectation of a single, perfect bullet. Some came to believe the Americans wielded the spirits of the dead, samurai souls corrupted into mercenaries of steel and glass. What Japanese officers did not understand was that the truth, though less supernatural, was no less terrifying. It was not magic, but patience, not spirits, but science. And those two things together gave the Marines an authority over the battlefield that no sword, no charge, no desperate courage could overcome. The written record of these encounters captured the shock more vividly than any official report. In a diary recovered on Guadalcanal, a private described how his lieutenant had been giving orders when his face suddenly vanished in a red mist. The soldier wrote that the sound of the shot reached them long after the officer had already fallen, leaving the men staring at the lifeless body as if lightning had struck from a clear sky. Another journal found on Saipan spoke of death arriving like a whisper, of comrades collapsing before anyone even understood they had been targeted. Official correspondence carried the same disbelief, though cloaked in military formality. A regimental intelligence officer on Tarawa wrote that the Americans appeared to possess rifles of unnatural reach, striking at distances beyond physical possibility. A brigade commander on Peleliu demanded countermeasures against the single-shot executions of our officers, though he admitted in the same report that no position could be identified, no weapon recovered, no enemy captured. The effect was corrosive. Young recruits read the diaries of fallen comrades and entered battle already convinced that they were being hunted by unseen killers. Veterans, hardened by campaigns in China, found their confidence shaken when men died beside them without warning. Commanders struggled to maintain control as units grew hesitant to move, fearful of exposing themselves even when urgent orders required it. The irony was that the Americans were few in number. A handful of sniper teams scattered across the front, operating independently, were inflicting casualties out of all proportion to their size. But the Japanese did not know this. To them, every hill might conceal a marksman, every ridge another invisible executioner. Reports to higher command spoke of multiple shooters, sometimes dozens, when in truth, only one or two Marine teams had been present. Thus, the written words of Japanese officers and soldiers reveal more than the tactical toll. They expose the growing realization that something fundamental had shifted in modern warfare. A single man with a rifle, aided by glass and patience, had become capable of altering the tempo of entire battles. And to those who faced it, this truth was more terrifying than any myth. The rifle itself seemed ordinary at first glance, just another American weapon captured from a fallen Marine. But when Japanese ordnance officers finally examined one closely, they realized they were holding something entirely different. The Springfield M19903A1 was no common infantry gun. Its barrel had been selected with match-grade precision, its trigger tuned to break crisply without slack, its stock fitted carefully to resist the warping heat and humidity of the Pacific. It was not merely a rifle. It was an instrument. And then there was the scope. The long steel tube of the Unertl, with its heavy objective lens and delicate external adjustments, bewildered the Japanese technicians who inspected it. Where their own Type 97 scopes offered a dim, distorted picture at 2.5 power, the American optic delivered crystal clarity at 8 times magnification. It had knobs that clicked with mechanical certainty, each quarter minute of angle adjustment shifting the point of impact with scientific consistency. To those who tested it, the effect was uncanny. Targets that appeared as vague shadows through Japanese glass became razor-sharp silhouettes through the Unertl. In combat, this meant the Marines could spot and engage officers at ranges once thought unreachable. A sword glinting in the sun, the slight lift of binoculars, the tilt of a map board, details invisible to the naked eye were suddenly fatal indicators of rank. From 800, 900, even 1,200 yards, the Marine sniper could select a single man and erase him with the squeeze of the trigger. What the Japanese saw as sorcery was, in truth, a union of engineering and marksmanship. American rifles had been tested on competitive firing lines long before the war, their shooters trained to calculate wind drift, bullet drop, and mirage. The Pacific Campaign merely carried this tradition into battle. Each sniper's shot was not a gamble, but a carefully constructed solution to a problem of distance, physics, and patience. And so, a simple piece of glass and steel, nothing more than an optic, became a weapon of strategic importance. It reshaped tactics, it disrupted command, and it turned the battlefield into a place where courage alone no longer mattered. The Japanese had prepared to fight men with rifles. They had not prepared to fight mathematics sharpened into a weapon. By the autumn of 1942, the Japanese were beginning to understand the pattern, though they could do little to stop it. Marine snipers no longer targeted only exposed officers giving speeches or studying maps. They began dismantling the very structure of Japanese assaults. A machine gun crew setting up its tripod would see the gunner fall before the weapon could be fired. Artillery observers attempting to signal coordinates collapsed one after another, their binoculars shattered, along with their skulls. At night, infiltrators, who had crept silently toward Marine lines, were cut down the instant a leader raised his hand to gesture. Each loss created more than a dead man. It created paralysis. Without officers, attacks stalled before they began. Without machine gunners, assaults lost their fire support. Without artillery observers, barrages went blind. Entire operations ground to a halt because of a few well-placed bullets. Japanese commanders found themselves forced to issue orders from underground bunkers, unable to lead from the front, stripped of the visible courage their soldiers expected. Reports describe how on Guadalcanal, a battalion lost half its company commanders in just 2 days to precise single shots. On Saipan, one regiment recorded that 17 officers above the rank of lieutenant were killed by rifle fire during a single engagement. Each casualty meant confusion in the ranks, young soldiers suddenly leaderless, advancing without coordination, retreating without orders. The Marines understood this effect and deliberately exploited it. Snipers were instructed to ignore common soldiers when officers were present. Swords, pistols, binoculars, these were the marks of rank that drew the crosshairs first. Killing a single leader could unravel the strength of an entire unit more effectively than mowing down dozens of enlisted men. The battlefield became a chessboard, and the snipers were removing queens and bishops while leaving pawns to scatter in panic. To the Japanese infantry, it felt like fighting an enemy who always knew where to strike. Courage and determination meant little when every effort to rally troops ended with another officer falling lifeless to the dirt. And slowly, the realization spread. They were not simply losing men. They were losing the very ability to command war. The failure began with intelligence. Japanese headquarters had entered the Pacific War convinced that American rifles were outdated, that their soldiers were soft and poorly trained, relying on surplus weapons from the Great War. Reports from early clashes in the Philippines and Malaya reinforced this view, as the Japanese met little organized sniper resistance. By the time they landed on Guadalcanal, they still believed their own Type 97 and Type 99 rifles, limited though they were, represented the peak of battlefield marksmanship. Warnings existed, but they were ignored. Aerial reconnaissance had noted American supply shipments that included thousands of long optical tubes, Unertl scopes destined for the Marine Corps. Captured manuals revealed instructions for advanced marksmanship training. Even prisoner interrogations mentioned scout sniper schools in the United States. Yet intelligence officers dismissed these signs as irrelevant. convinced that technical details meant little compared to spirit and determination. When the first officer casualties mounted, headquarters labeled them coincidence, exaggeration, or the result of artillery fire. Division commanders wrote angry responses to reports of supernatural snipers, scolding units for cowardice. The official line remained the same. American rifles were inferior, their soldiers lacking the spiritual strength to rival Japanese warriors. But in the field, reality told another story. Officers died behind their own lines, struck down in moments they believed safe. Entire regiments found themselves pinned by unseen fire, unable to advance or even raise their heads. And as the losses mounted, the refusal of higher command to acknowledge the threat left frontline units to face it alone. This gap between perception and reality became fatal. While Marines refined their techniques with every island, Japanese commanders clung to doctrine that dismissed long-range precision as impossible. They ordered more charges, more frontal assaults, more reliance on courage. Yet each attack foundered under the same invisible fire. The enemy had made mathematics a weapon, and Japan's intelligence services had failed to see it until it was far too late. For the Japanese, the clash was not only of weapons, but of philosophy. Their military tradition taught that victory flowed from spirit, an iron will, the courage to charge into fire, the acceptance of death as honor. In training halls and parade grounds, instructors spoke of the warrior's heart as the decisive factor, not the rifle in his hands. A soldier who believed could overcome any technical shortcoming. The Americans thought differently. Their Marine Corps had long nurtured a culture of marksmanship, rooted in competition ranges at Camp Perry and refined in decades of rifle matches. Accuracy was not a matter of instinct, but of science. Barrels were measured, ammunition loads weighed to fractions of a grain, scopes adjusted with precision instruments. Recruits were taught to read the wind as carefully as a sailor studies the sea, to calculate bullet drop and drift like mathematicians. On the battlefield, these opposing doctrines collided with brutal clarity. Japanese soldiers advanced in tightly bound units, shouting war cries, bayonets gleaming. Against them lay Marines, who remained motionless, rifles hidden under camouflage, eyes pressed to optics. Courage carried the Japanese forward, but a single click of an adjustment knob and a steady trigger pull erased their leaders before they reached striking distance. Survivors began to see the contrast with growing despair. No amount of shouting or spiritual strength could protect a man from a bullet that arrived unseen from 1,000 yards. The louder they cried, "Banzai," the more clearly they marked themselves for the crosshairs. Where the Japanese believed war was decided by the purity of spirit, the Marines proved that war could be reduced to equations, to angles and minutes of arc, to steel and glass applied with discipline. This clash of ideals left scars deeper than the casualties. Diaries recovered after battles speak of soldiers questioning the very foundations of their training. If courage could not shield them, if honor could not even allow them to see their killer, then what meaning did the warrior's path hold? For many, the realization was devastating. The Americans had stripped combat of glory and turned it into mathematics. And mathematics could not be defeated by spirit alone. On Saipan, the scale of the problem could no longer be denied. The battlefield stretched across jagged coral ridges and dense thickets, terrain that seemed ideal for Japanese defense. Yet every attempt to organize a counterattack unraveled under the same silent pattern. Officers collapsing before their men, runners never reaching their destinations, machine gunners silenced before firing a belt. Marine sniper teams took up positions on high ground overlooking assembly areas. Through their 8 power scopes, they studied movement for hours, noting which figures carried swords, which gave hand signals, which men drew the deference of others. When Japanese forces gathered for assaults, those leaders were the first to die. Sometimes, a single volley of carefully placed shots broke an entire regiment's cohesion before the charge even began. On Iwo Jima, the effect grew even more devastating. The island's volcanic ridges created long sightlines across black sand valleys. Japanese commanders believed the distances made them safe, but Marine marksmen saw opportunity. From cover high on the rocks, they fired at targets nearly 1,000 yards away, bullets threading into bunker slits and trench openings. Officers studying maps in caves or dugouts were struck down the moment they stepped into daylight. Japanese reports from both battles speak of disbelief. Officers wrote that, "The Americans strike from beyond vision," and "Our safe positions are illusions." Some units removed insignia and abandoned swords, hoping anonymity would save them. Yet body language betrayed them. The man giving orders, the soldier who walked with confidence, the figure to whom others deferred. To the trained eyes behind a scope, rank could not be disguised. By the time the battles ended, the toll on Japanese leadership was catastrophic. Entire chains of command had been decapitated by rifle fire alone. Survivors whispered that it was not artillery or armor that doomed them, but the ghosts with glass eyes on the ridges. And in the silence between shots, the Marines had reshaped the fight, proving that a few patient men with rifles could paralyze entire armies. The survivors who returned from those islands carried more than wounds. They carried stories of terror that words barely contained. In diaries found on Guam and Tinian, soldiers wrote of patrols that began with confidence and ended in horror. One account described an 8-man team moving through sugarcane at midday when the man in front suddenly fell with a neat hole in his chest. The second collapsed seconds later, struck between the eyes. The survivors dropped to their bellies, crawling for hours through the razor leaves, convinced they were being toyed with. Only 3 made it back, and each swore that the unseen American sniper had deliberately spared them to spread fear. Another journal from Okinawa tells of men refusing to stand, even when shells crashed around them. They preferred to face artillery and mortars, deafening but impersonal, rather than risk the single, intimate strike of a sniper's bullet. One soldier admitted that he envied comrades killed by flamethrowers or grenades because their deaths came swiftly, without the humiliation of being singled out and executed like prey. Even seasoned officers were shaken. Reports spoke of commanders conducting inspections only at night, crouching low, issuing orders from tunnels rather than open ground. A major on Peleliu confessed that he had begun to dread the daylight, feeling watched whenever he left cover. His men whispered that he aged 10 years in a single month of battle, his hair turning white as comrades fell one by one. The psychological effect spread further than any bullet could reach. Entire units grew hesitant, avoiding movement under the sun, abandoning strong positions because they believed snipers were waiting. The battlefield became haunted in their imagination. A ridgeline was not just high ground, it was death's perch. A broken control tower was not just ruins, it was a nest for invisible hunters. Thus, Marine snipers achieved what artillery barrages and bombing raids often could not. They shattered morale from within. Japanese infantrymen no longer feared only combat. They feared the very act of being seen. And in that fear, the battle was already half lost before the trigger was ever pulled. The technical gap could not be bridged, no matter how desperately Japanese forces tried. Their Type 97 rifles, once thought respectable tools for precision, revealed their limits under the harsh conditions of the Pacific. Thin barrels warped from heat, wooden stocks swelled in the humidity, and the small 2.5 power scopes fogged with the first tropical rains. Even when conditions were perfect, the rifles rarely grouped tighter than 4 minutes of angle, enough to hit a man at 300 meters, but useless at the distances where Marines operated. By contrast, the Springfield M1903A1 rifles selected for Marine snipers were the best of the best. Each barrel had been hand-tested. Only the most accurate were approved for sniper work. The rifles were tuned by skilled armorers, their triggers adjusted to a clean, consistent break. Fitted with the Unertl 8 power scope, they became more than battlefield weapons. They became instruments of measured destruction. At 1,000 yards, a trained Marine could place his shots within a circle, no wider than a man's head. The difference in ammunition only deepened the divide. Japanese snipers used the same mass-produced cartridges issued to common infantry, with powder charges that varied so much that every bullet flew slightly differently. American snipers were supplied with match-grade rounds, boat-tail bullets, carefully weighed charges, brass sorted for uniformity. This meant their calculations were reliable, their shots repeatable. A Marine sniper could trust that the round would land exactly where his scope predicted, while his Japanese counterpart was left to chance. When Japanese officers finally examined captured rifles, their shock was profound. Reports described disbelief at the clarity of the Unertl optics, at the precise clicks of its adjustment knobs, at the heavy construction that maintained zero after dozens of shots. Some compared it to a surveyor's instrument rather than a weapon. They admitted that nothing in Japanese industry could replicate such quality. In the end, the battlefield told the truth. Japanese snipers waited in trees or spider holes, holding their fire until Marines closed within 300 meters. The Marines answered from 3 times that distance, unseen and untouchable. It was not just a duel of rifles, it was a duel of centuries. One side carried the warrior spirit, the other carried the machinery of modern science. And on every island across the Pacific, science prevailed. The Japanese tried to adapt. On Saipan, and later on Peleliu, officers were ordered to strip away swords, remove insignia, and even wear the same tattered uniforms as their men. Company commanders crawled in the dirt beside privates, desperate to blur the lines of rank. Colonel Nakagawa on Peleliu even forbade groups of more than 3 soldiers to gather in daylight, knowing a sniper's eye was always searching for patterns. But concealment was never enough. To a trained Marine spotter, rank revealed itself in other ways. The man who pointed directions, who leaned over a map, who walked in the middle while others deferred. These subtle cues stood out through an 8-power scope as brightly as any badge of honor. Camouflage could hide a sword, but not the posture of command. The Marines exploited this relentlessly. Reports from Peleliu describe snipers threading bullets through the narrowest embrasures, striking officers who believed themselves protected behind coral bunkers. On Iwo Jima, observers in the volcanic ridges watched Japanese soldiers scuttle through trenches like insects, waiting for the unmistakable gesture of authority before firing. Time and again, it was the leader who fell first, leaving soldiers leaderless and adrift. In desperation, Japanese units tried decoys, dummy officers fashioned from bamboo, men deliberately carrying swords to draw fire. But the ruse rarely worked. Marine spotters watched long enough to see who truly commanded. They fired only when certain, conserving ammunition, ensuring that each shot carried maximum effect. The result was devastating. In some battles, nearly half of company-grade officers were eliminated in the first week of fighting by sniper fire alone. Communications collapsed, attacks lost cohesion, and defense turned to confusion. Survivors later admitted that they had felt abandoned, not because their officers lacked courage, but because unseen bullets stripped them away one by one. Thus, the Marine sniper's doctrine achieved what bombardments and tanks could not. It severed the head of the Japanese army at the very moment it tried to fight. Every officer who dared to lead in daylight risked becoming another body in the dirt, taken not by artillery or bombs, but by a single bullet guided by glass, patience, and mathematics. By the time the fighting reached the Philippines, the Japanese knew they were facing something beyond ordinary riflemen. Manila's shattered buildings became hunting grounds, where Marine snipers turned the ruins into nests of death. From the broken windows of government offices, they looked down long avenues littered with rubble, and could strike at officers trying to direct defense more than 800 yards away. In the shell of the control tower at Nichols Field, a single team watched for hours before eliminating 3 separate machine gun crews with 3 deliberate shots. Urban combat had always been the Japanese expectation. Close quarters, bayonets, grenades, ferocious assaults from room to room. Instead, they found themselves dying before they even reached the fight. Marines did not need to rush into ambushes when their rifles allowed them to dominate entire districts from afar. A sniper hidden in a collapsed rooftop could lock down a street for an entire day, forcing Japanese units to crawl underground and move only by night. Officers' reports from Manila were filled with frustration. One naval commander admitted that his men had grown unwilling to step into daylight, describing death arriving from angles that defy comprehension. Another report noted that attempts to launch counterattacks were delayed for hours because leaders refused to expose themselves to view long enough to organize. The Americans, it seemed, saw everything. What unnerved the Japanese most was not only the killing, but the knowledge gathering. Sniper teams spent as much time observing as firing. They reported supply routes, command posts, hidden strongpoints. Artillery barrages followed soon after, perfectly adjusted, thanks to the same optics that guided the rifle fire. For every officer killed, many more positions were exposed, mapped, and destroyed. In Manila, the Japanese discovered that Marine snipers were not merely assassins, but extensions of the Marine Corps' entire war machine. Their scopes turned the chaos of ruins into clarity, their patience unraveled defenses before battles began, and their presence ensured that no street, no trench, no command post could ever truly be safe. It was a kind of war the Japanese had never envisioned, one fought by eyes and glass as much as by bullets and blood.